You've been nursing the same cup of coffee for hours, trying to stay warm and unnoticed in the corner of the cafe. The worn chair beneath you and the fading light outside seem to match your quiet mood. Then the manager approaches, his expression polite but firm, a look you know all too well. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he says, the unspoken message clear. "You're taking up space without enough to show for it." You nod quietly, already bracing yourself to gather your jacket and step back into the solitude of your small apartment. There's no anger, only resignation. The world outside seems far away, and the weight of days spent forgotten presses down. But in this moment of quiet defeat, neither you nor the manager realizes what's about to change everything. Suddenly, the front door swings open, and 5 Navy SEALs stride inside. Their presence commands the room. Focused, confident, and unmistakably united. They don't just order coffee, they notice you. Recognition flashes in their eyes, and the atmosphere shifts instantly. With quiet respect, the SEALs stand by your side, making it clear you belong here. What began as a moment of dismissal turns into one of honor, as these warriors acknowledge the true weight behind your worn exterior, reminding everyone that respect is earned in ways far deeper than money or appearances. Welcome to Echoes of Honor, where we discover how respect can transform the most ordinary moments into something extraordinary. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The corner cafe on Maple Street had the kind of atmosphere that attracted people who needed a quiet place to think. Small round tables, mismatched chairs, and walls lined with local artwork created a space that felt more like someone's living room than a commercial establishment. The coffee was good, the prices reasonable, and the staff generally left customers alone to read, work, or simply sit with their thoughts. Frank Martinez had been coming here for 3 months, always ordering the same thing, a medium black coffee and occasionally a blueberry muffin. He typically arrived around 10 in the morning when the breakfast rush had died down, but before the lunch crowd arrived. He'd find a corner table away from the main traffic flow and settle in with a paperback book or sometimes just his own thoughts. At 71, Frank moved with deliberate care, the result of old injuries that had never quite healed properly. His clothes were clean but worn, his shoes polished but showing their age. Most of the regular customers barely noticed him. Just another elderly man who seemed to have nowhere else to be during the day. The staff had initially been friendly, offering refills and engaging in brief conversations about the weather or current events. But as weeks passed and Frank's pattern became clear, one coffee stretched across several hours, attitudes began to shift. This was a business, after all, and tables occupied by low-spending customers meant fewer opportunities for profit. Frank was aware of the growing tension but didn't know how to address it. His Social Security check covered his basic needs, but luxuries like multiple cups of coffee or expensive cafe meals weren't financially realistic. The corner cafe represented his primary social interaction, the only place where he felt connected to the world outside his small apartment. What the staff and other customers didn't know was that Frank's careful budgeting stemmed from more than simple financial constraints. His military pension should have provided comfortable retirement, but medical expenses from service-connected injuries consumed most of his income. The proud man who had once led troops in combat now found himself counting quarters to afford coffee. Frank's military bearing remained evident despite his civilian clothes and quiet demeanor. He sat straight-backed, kept his space organized, and treated everyone with respectful courtesy. Observant people might have noticed the way he automatically surveyed room entrances, positioned himself with clear sight lines to doors, or maintained the kind of situational awareness that suggested military training. But in the busy rhythm of cafe life, few people paid attention to such details. Frank was simply the old man who took up table space without generating much revenue. His polite demeanor and quiet presence made him easy to overlook, which was exactly how he preferred things. On this particular Tuesday morning, the cafe was experiencing heavier than usual traffic. A delayed morning commute had pushed more customers than normal into the mid-morning time slot, creating pressure for available seating. Frank sat at his usual corner table, having finished his coffee but reluctant to leave his only source of human interaction for the day. The manager, Derek Walsh, was a pragmatic businessman in his 30s who had taken over the cafe from his retiring uncle. He understood the economics of restaurant operations and the need to maximize table turnover during busy periods. He'd been watching Frank's pattern for weeks, growing increasingly frustrated with the lost revenue potential. Walsh approached Frank's table with practiced politeness that barely concealed his business-focused irritation. "Excuse me, sir," he said in a tone that suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. "I notice you've been here for quite a while with just one coffee." Frank looked up from his book, already understanding where this conversation was headed. "Yes, I have," he replied quietly. "Is there a problem?" "Well, we have customers waiting for tables, and you've been occupying this spot for over 2 hours with a single purchase," Walsh continued. "I'm going to have to ask you to either order something else or make room for paying customers." Frank nodded with the resignation of someone accustomed to being unwelcome in places where his limited resources marked him as undesirable. "I understand," he said simply, beginning to gather his book and jacket. The exchange attracted attention from nearby tables, some customers glancing over with curiosity while others studiously avoided looking. Frank's graceful acceptance of the dismissal suggested this wasn't his first experience with such situations. Walsh felt a twinge of guilt as he watched the elderly man prepare to leave, but business concerns overrode sympathy. The cafe had bills to pay and profits to maintain. Customers who lingered without spending money represented a problem that required firm management. Frank stood slowly, his movements careful as always, and placed a worn dollar bill on the table as a tip despite being asked to leave. The gesture demonstrated a dignity that made Walsh slightly uncomfortable, but the manager maintained his position. Business was business. As Frank moved toward the door, several customers watched his departure with expressions ranging from sympathy to indifference. The moment felt awkward but routine. Another elderly person with limited resources learning where they weren't welcome. Frank reached for the door handle, his hand already turning the knob, when it suddenly opened from the outside. 5 men in casual civilian clothes entered the cafe, their movement coordinated and alert in a way that immediately changed the energy of the room. The newcomers were clearly military personnel despite their civilian attire. Their bearing, the way they scanned the room upon entry, their synchronized movement patterns, everything about them suggested elite training and operational experience. Frank paused in the doorway, recognizing something familiar in their demeanor. The lead man among the group noticed Frank immediately, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the subtle military bearing that Frank couldn't completely hide despite his civilian appearance. Years of training had taught these men to recognize fellow warriors, even in unexpected circumstances. What happened next would transform an uncomfortable moment of dismissal into something entirely different, as recognition flowed between warriors across generations of service. The lead SEAL, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, held the door open as his team filed into the cafe. His eyes met Frank's briefly, and something in that exchange triggered the kind of recognition that happened between military personnel, a subtle acknowledgement of shared experience that civilians rarely noticed. Rodriguez stepped aside to let Frank pass, but his attention remained focused on the elderly man. Years of tactical training had taught him to read people quickly, and everything about Frank suggested military background. The straight posture despite his age, the way he moved with deliberate precision, the respectful nod he offered to the SEALs, all indicated someone with service experience. Frank paused just outside the door, uncertain whether to leave immediately or acknowledge the obvious military bearing of the men who had just entered. The brief eye contact with Rodriguez had stirred memories of the brotherhood he'd once known, the instant connection that existed between warriors regardless of when or where they'd served. Inside the cafe, Walsh watched the interaction with growing confusion. The 5 new customers were clearly military personnel, the kind who typically spent well and caused no problems. But their attention seemed focused on the elderly man he'd just asked to leave, creating an awkward dynamic he hadn't anticipated. Rodriguez made a quick decision that would define the next several minutes. Instead of finding a table for his team, he stepped back outside to speak with Frank. The other SEALs remained near the entrance, their positioning casual but alert, creating a subtle barrier between their chief and the rest of the cafe. "Excuse me, sir," Rodriguez said respectfully to Frank. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you military?" Frank hesitated, uncertain about engaging in conversation when he'd just been asked to leave the establishment. "Marine Corps," he answered quietly. "Retired." Rodriguez's expression shifted to immediate respect. Marines held a special place in SEAL culture, sister warriors who understood the demands of elite military service. "What unit, sir?" he asked, his tone carrying genuine interest rather than casual curiosity. "2nd Battalion, 7th Marines," Frank replied, still uncertain about where this conversation was leading. "Vietnam, 2 tours." The answer hit Rodriguez with significant impact. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines had seen heavy action in Vietnam, participating in some of the war's most challenging operations. Frank's 2 tours indicated extended combat experience, the kind that shaped men in fundamental ways. Rodriguez turned slightly toward his team and made a subtle hand signal that brought them to attention without obvious military bearing. To casual observers, it looked like friends gathering for coffee, but Frank recognized the communication patterns of a well-trained unit. "Sir," Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying the weight of deep respect, "my team and I were about to have coffee. Would you mind if we asked you to join us?" Frank's confusion was evident on his face. "I was just leaving," he said, glancing back toward the cafe where Walsh continued watching through the window. "The manager asked me to go." Rodriguez's expression hardened slightly as he processed this information. His protective instincts, trained through years of looking out for fellow warriors, immediately activated. "Why were you asked to leave, sir?" Frank's reluctance to create problems was clear in his response. "I'd been here a while with just one coffee. It's a business, I understand." Rodriguez looked through the cafe window at Walsh, then back at Frank. Everything about the situation struck him as wrong. In the military, senior personnel were treated with respect regardless of circumstances. The idea of a Vietnam veteran being asked to leave a public establishment because he couldn't afford multiple drinks violated every principle Rodriguez held about honoring those who had served. "Sir," Rodriguez said firmly, "you're not going anywhere. You're having coffee with us." Frank started to protest, but Rodriguez held up a hand with the kind of authority that came from leading men in combat situations. "With respect, sir, this isn't negotiable. My team needs to hear from someone with your experience." The statement wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. SEALs did value learning from veterans of previous conflicts, and Rodriguez genuinely respected Frank's service record. But more importantly, Rodriguez understood that fellow warriors didn't abandon each other, especially when civilian establishments failed to show proper respect. Rodriguez gestured toward the cafe entrance. "After you, sir," he said with the deference typically reserved for senior officers. Frank hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but recognizing the futility of arguing with someone who had made up his mind. As they entered the cafe together, the dynamic in the room immediately shifted. Walsh, who had been preparing to ensure Frank's departure, suddenly found himself facing not just the elderly man he'd dismissed, but 5 obviously elite military personnel who were treating that same man with obvious respect. Rodriguez approached Walsh directly, his demeanor professional but carrying an edge that suggested consequences for wrong answers. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying across the now-quiet cafe. "Is there a problem here?" Walsh felt the weight of attention from his other customers, many of whom had stopped their conversations to watch the developing situation. "No problem," he said carefully. "Just managing seating during our busy period." "I see," Rodriguez replied, his tone suggesting he saw more than Walsh might prefer. "And the gentleman you asked to leave? What was the issue there?" Walsh's discomfort was visible as he realized his business decision was being scrutinized by people whose approval he suddenly wanted. "He'd been here for several hours with just one purchase," he explained, his justification sounding weaker under Rodriguez's steady gaze. Rodriguez nodded slowly, processing the information while his team positioned themselves casually around Frank, creating a protective formation that wasn't obvious to civilians but would be immediately recognizable to anyone with military training. "I understand business concerns," Rodriguez said, his voice remaining professional while carrying an undertone that suggested Walsh should listen carefully. but I think there might be some information you're missing about your customer. Walsh looked confused, uncertain about what information could possibly matter in a straightforward business decision. Around the cafe, other customers were beginning to pay closer attention to the conversation, sensing that something significant was developing. Rodriguez turned slightly toward Frank, including him in the conversation while maintaining his focus on Walsh. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Frank Martinez, United States Marine Corps. 2 tours in Vietnam with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines." The announcement carried weight that Walsh didn't immediately understand, but the respectful tone in Rodriguez's voice suggested significance beyond a simple introduction. Frank looked uncomfortable with the attention, but maintained his dignity with the bearing that had never truly left him. Rodriguez continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Gunnery Sergeant Martinez served in combat operations that most people can't imagine. He led Marines in situations where courage meant the difference between life and death for his men." The cafe had gone completely quiet now. All conversations stopped as customers focused on the unfolding scene. Walsh found himself the center of attention in a way he'd never intended, with his business decision being evaluated by people whose judgment suddenly mattered more than he'd anticipated. "The men in my unit," Rodriguez added, gesturing toward his team, "we study the tactics and leadership principles developed by Marines like Gunnery Sergeant Martinez. His generation of warriors created the foundation for everything we do today." Frank shifted uncomfortably and used to such public recognition, but Rodriguez's words carried the weight of genuine respect rather than empty flattery. The young SEAL was speaking truth about the debt that current military personnel owed to Vietnam veterans. Rodriguez looked directly at Walsh as he delivered his conclusion. "So when you ask a man like this to leave because he can't afford multiple cups of coffee, you're not just making a business decision. You're showing disrespect to someone who has earned more honor than most people will ever understand." The silence that followed was profound. Walsh felt the weight of judgment from his customers, many of whom were now looking at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disapproval. His simple business decision had been reframed as a moral failure. Rodriguez wasn't finished. "My team came here for coffee and conversation. We'd be honored to have Gunnery Sergeant Martinez join us. The question is whether this establishment wants our business, or if we should find somewhere that better appreciates the people we respect." The ultimatum was clear and powerful. Walsh found himself facing the loss of not just 5 customers, but the respect of everyone in his cafe who had witnessed the exchange. The business calculation that had seemed so straightforward minutes earlier had become a test of character. He was failing publicly. Walsh's face went through a series of expressions as the full weight of the situation hit him. He looked at Frank, seeing him not as a low-spending customer taking up valuable table space, but as someone whose service had earned respect he'd failed to recognize. The shame was visible in his expression as he processed how badly he'd misjudged the situation. I had no idea," Walsh stammered, his earlier business confidence completely evaporated. "Sir, I apologize. I didn't know about your service." Rodriguez's response was immediate and cutting. His service shouldn't matter for basic human decency, but since you need context, this man trains warriors like us. The young SEAL turned to address not just Walsh but the entire cafe, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing important operations. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're in the presence of a Marine who served 2 combat tours in Vietnam. The tactics he learned, the leadership he demonstrated, the courage he showed under fire. These became the foundation for modern military operations." Frank remained standing quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but maintaining his dignity through years of practice at handling difficult situations. His discomfort was obvious, but so was his inherent strength of character. Rodriguez continued, his respect evident in every word. "In SEAL training, we study small unit tactics developed by Marines like Gunnery Sergeant Martinez. We learn leadership principles from men who led troops in combat. We practice courage that was demonstrated by his generation of warriors." The SEAL paused, then added something that brought the moment into sharp focus for everyone present. This man didn't serve for recognition or thanks. He served because his country needed him. He led Marines in combat because his men needed him. And today, he sits quietly in a cafe because he understands that service means putting others before yourself. Walsh felt the weight of every eye in the cafe focused on him. His customers, many of whom had been coming to the corner cafe for years, were seeing their familiar gathering place transformed into a stage where his character was being measured and found lacking. "Gunnery Sergeant," Rodriguez said, turning to Frank with obvious respect, "my team would be honored if you'd join us for coffee. And anything else you'd like." Frank started to protest, but Rodriguez held up a hand with gentle authority. "Sir, in the military, we take care of our own. That doesn't end when we leave service." Rodriguez then looked directly at Walsh, his message clear and non-negotiable. "We'll need a large table. And Gunnery Sergeant Martinez will be our guest for as long as he wants to stay." Walsh nodded quickly, eager to make amends for his earlier mistake. "Of course," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "The corner booth, it's our best table. And please, everything is on the house." "That's not necessary," Frank said quietly, his pride evident despite his circumstances. "I can pay for my own coffee." Rodriguez smiled, the first warmth he'd shown since entering the cafe. "Sir, with respect, when my team buys coffee for a Marine, it's not charity. It's honor." The other SEALs, who had remained quietly positioned around the interaction, now moved with coordinated precision to arrange seating. Their movements were respectful but protective, ensuring Frank was treated with the deference they believed he deserved. As they settled into the corner booth, with Frank positioned as the guest of honor, Rodriguez made one final statement that transformed the morning for everyone present. "Gunnery Sergeant Martinez," he said loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "Would you mind sharing some of your experiences with my team? We're always looking to learn from warriors who've proven themselves in combat." Frank's reluctance was clear, but the genuine respect in Rodriguez's request was impossible to ignore. "I don't know how much help I can be," he said modestly. "It was a long time ago." "Sir," Rodriguez replied, "courage doesn't have an expiration date. And the lessons you learned saving Marines in Vietnam are the same lessons that save SEALs today." The conversation that followed would change everyone who witnessed it. Frank, initially reluctant to discuss his experiences, gradually opened up under the respectful questioning of men who understood the weight of what he had endured. His stories weren't dramatic tales of heroism, but quiet accounts of leadership under pressure, of decisions made when lives hung in the balance, of the responsibility that came with carrying the trust of the men under his command. The SEALs listened with the intensity of students learning from a master teacher. Their questions were specific, professional, focused on tactics and leadership rather than dramatic details. Frank responded with the measured wisdom of someone who had faced life and death decisions and learned from them. Around the cafe, other customers found themselves drawn into the conversation. Business meetings were forgotten as people listened to first-hand accounts of combat leadership. College students stopped studying to hear about courage under fire. Elderly customers shared their own stories of family members who had served. Walsh, initially focused on damage control, found himself genuinely moved by what he was witnessing. His cafe had been transformed from a simple business into a place where respect flowed between generations of warriors, where civilian customers gained new understanding of military service, where community formed around recognition of sacrifice. The morning stretched into afternoon as Frank shared experiences he'd rarely discussed with anyone. The SEAL's respectful attention encouraged him to reveal insights about leadership, courage, and the bonds formed between men who depend on each other for survival. His initial discomfort with being the center of attention gradually gave way to the satisfaction of mentoring younger warriors. Walsh approached the table periodically, not to hurry them along, but to ensure everyone had what they needed. His earlier focus on table turnover had been replaced by understanding that something important was happening in his establishment, something more valuable than any single day's revenue. Other customers came and went throughout the day, but many lingered longer than usual, drawn by the conversation taking place in the corner booth. Frank's quiet wisdom and the SEAL's respectful attention created an atmosphere that elevated the entire cafe experience. As the afternoon wound down, Rodriguez addressed the group with obvious reluctance to end the session. "Gunnery Sergeant, this has been incredibly valuable for my team. We've learned more about leadership today than in weeks of formal training." Frank shook his head modestly. "You men are already the best. You don't need lessons from an old Marine." "Sir," Rodriguez replied firmly, "every generation of warriors builds on what came before. Your generation created the foundation. We're just trying to live up to the standard you set. The SEALs prepared to leave, but not before ensuring Frank understood that this wasn't a one-time encounter. Rodriguez handed him a card with contact information, explaining that Frank was welcome to visit their base, share his experiences with other teams, and remain connected to the military community he'd served. Gunnery Sergeant, Rodriguez said as they prepared to part. You mentioned you come here regularly. My team has training in this area every Tuesday. Would you mind if we joined you for coffee next week? Frank's surprise was evident. You'd want to do this again? Sir, Rodriguez replied. We'd be honored to learn from you on a regular basis. Besides, every Tuesday you're here means every Tuesday we know where to find the best military leadership instructor in the area. As the SEALs departed, Walsh approached Frank's table with obvious nervousness. Mr. Martinez, he said formally, I owe you a sincere apology. I had no idea about your service, but more importantly, I treated you poorly regardless of your background. Frank waved off the apology with characteristic grace. You're running a business. I understand the pressures. No, Walsh insisted. That's no excuse. I've been thinking about this all day, and I want to make something clear. You're welcome here anytime, for as long as you want to stay. Your coffee is always on the house, not because of your military service, but because you're exactly the kind of customer I want in my cafe. Walsh paused, then added something that would define their relationship going forward. Actually, I've been thinking about starting a weekly gathering for local veterans. Would you be interested in helping me organize something like that? Frank's face showed surprise at the unexpected invitation. The idea of the corner cafe becoming a regular meeting place for veterans appealed to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. I'd be honored to help, he said quietly. The conversation between Frank and Walsh continued as they discussed possibilities for creating a space where veterans could gather regularly, share experiences, and maintain connections to the military community. What had started as a business dispute had evolved into something that would benefit the entire local veteran population. As Frank finally prepared to leave that evening, he reflected on how dramatically the day had changed. He'd entered the cafe as an unwelcome customer taking up space without spending money. He was leaving as a respected member of a community that valued his experience and wanted his continued presence. The transformation hadn't come from anything Frank had done or said. It had come from recognition, from warriors who understood what his service meant, who took the time to educate others about respect and honor, who demonstrated that the military brotherhood extends beyond active duty. Rodriguez and his team had given Frank something more valuable than free coffee or polite conversation. They had given him renewed connection to the community he'd served, confirmation that his experiences had value, and evidence that the sacrifices he'd made were remembered and appreciated by those who followed in his footsteps. The corner cafe would never be quite the same after that Tuesday afternoon. Walsh had learned lessons about respect and recognition that would influence how he treated all his customers. Regular patrons had gained new understanding about the veterans in their community, and Frank had found a place where his military experience was valued rather than overlooked. Most importantly, the interaction demonstrated something essential about how respect flows between generations of warriors. Rodriguez and his team hadn't defended Frank out of obligation or political correctness. They had acted from genuine understanding of what his service represented and conviction that such service deserved recognition. The weekly gatherings that Walsh and Frank organized became a fixture at the corner cafe, drawing veterans from throughout the area who had been looking for exactly this kind of community connection. The small coffee shop evolved into something larger, a place where military experience was valued, where stories were shared, and where the brotherhood forged in service continued long after uniforms were hung up. Frank's regular presence at these gatherings transformed him from an isolated retiree into a respected elder whose experiences enriched the lives of younger veterans still finding their way in civilian life. His quiet wisdom and steady presence provided exactly what many of them needed, proof that the transition from military to civilian life was possible while maintaining the values and connections that military service had created. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought in coffee shops and civilian spaces, where respect must be earned through understanding rather than demanded through rank. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from building bridges between communities that should naturally support each other. Rodriguez's intervention that Tuesday morning created ripple effects that extended far beyond one elderly veteran's temporary embarrassment. It demonstrated how recognition and respect can transform ordinary moments into opportunities for connection, education, and community building. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.